Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Talk Show. Today, we're going to be talking about things you may not know about Pontius Pilate.
That's right. We're lucky to be joined by Jimmy Akin, a master apologist from Catholic Answers and his own podcast, to talk about the life of the man who sentenced Christ to death. Let's get started.
All right, Jimmy, welcome back. It's always good to have you on the show. You've given a lot of our listeners a lot of insight over time. And since you've been coming on, I know I've been watching a little bit more of your shows, and they're terrific.
Thank you.
Mysterious World. Yeah, it's terrific. Yeah, I just followed the last one you did on Enoch.
Yeah. We did a two-parter on the first book of Enoch and got a lot of positive feedback on it.
Yeah,
well, I'll make sure we put a link to that. But, selfishly, I love having Jimmy on because he's one of my favorite people to talk to. And this is one of the perks of having a widely distributed and watched podcast is that you can get great guests like Jimmy. And, when we get into certain topics, we really need to rely on the expertise of people who just know more than us and who have the kind of brain power that you have to hide under a cowboy hat because it's so voluminous, right? And Pontius Pilate is a really mysterious and pivotal figure in the history of humanity, in the history of the world, and in the history of the plan of salvation. In so much as that even when you look at, say, the Apostles' Creed, Pontius Pilate is mentioned in there, and St. Peter is not, St. Paul is not. So, I've been meditating on the sorrowful mysteries, a lot of the Rosary, and in doing that, I kept on thinking about the role of Pontius Pilate, how he is kind of drawn into it in a more malice-filled way than maybe Simon of Cyrene, but he is still completely involved in this drama of the Passion of Christ. And very little is known about him, at least by myself and I think by most people. So that's, Jimmy, why we wanted to have you on and really try to explore this person who's so pivotal in our faith life.
Yeah, well, I'll be happy to tell you whatever I can. We know more about Pontius Pilate than we do any other Roman governor of Judea, principally because of his role in the Gospels. But he is mentioned by Jewish sources such as Josephus and Philo, and so we know a little bit about him from there. We don't know too much about him from Roman sources. We do have a few additional things we know. So there's a notable archaeological discovery I'm sure we'll talk about, but I'm happy to answer any questions I can about him.
So let's kind of maybe start from the beginning. How did Pontius Pilate find himself as the governor or procurator of Judea? And what would that position have entailed? What were his responsibilities? And, what was the kind of geopolitical sense at the time that you have this Roman there governing Judea, even though you had a king and you had the Sanhedrin, you had all these things? What is that? How does he find himself there in Jerusalem?
Well, so to understand that, we need a little bit of backstory. And the Romans gained control of Israel in 63 BC. And then in 39 BC, they installed Herod the Great as king. He was an Idumean, but he was Jewish by religion. And he lived until 1 BC. Now, you'll hear some folks say 4 BC, but the better evidence really supports 1. And when he died, there was a succession issue. And he had a bunch of sons from several different marriages because he was a polygamist. He had multiple wives. And he had a nasty habit of killing his sons. He thought they were plotting against him, and he was paranoid against anyone plotting against him. That's why he did the slaughter of the innocents.
Well, Ryan, you got 4 boys, so don't take any notes from this.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on him.
But so he had a group of sons, 3 in particular, that became prominent after his death. Now, he had planned for, apparently, he had altered his will so that one of his sons, named Archaeological, would inherit his kingdom. But the other sons didn't go along with that. And so they took a trip to Rome, and they appealed to Augustus Caesar because Herod was a client king that had been appointed by the Roman Senate. And so they appealed to Augustus Caesar, and Caesar decided to split Herod's kingdom into multiple parts. And so different sons of Herod got different parts of it. The part that Archelaus ended up getting was the majority of the kingdom, and it was the southern part of the kingdom. So it included Jerusalem. It did not include Galilee. A different son of Herod got that. And then another son got some further removed parts. But Archelaus was a really bad ruler. And we read about this in Matthew, where it says that when Joseph got the word that Herod the Great was dead, he was bringing his family back, and he learned Archelaus is ruling in Jerusalem, which includes the Bethlehem area. And so he was afraid to go there, and he was warned in a dream, go up to Galilee instead. Well, Archelaus, even before he was appointed leader, his technical title was ethnarch, meaning the leader of an ethnic group of a people. Before he was even given that title, at Passover, a riot started in the temple, and he killed 3,000 people and canceled Passover. So, this is just imagine the magnitude of that, because this is a major Jewish feast. And it's one of the 3 feasts where all Jews are supposed to travel to Jerusalem to be there for it. And he kills 3,000 people and says, go home, everybody, no Passover this year. So it was after that he got his title as ethnarch, and he reigned until AD 6. But people were continually unhappy with him, and they ended up appealing to Caesar, and Caesar said, okay, you're out of there. You're exiled to France. I'm putting in a Roman governor. And so we got a sequence of Roman governors, and there were 4 of them before Pilate. But then Pilate was the 5th Roman governor. We don't know a lot about his life before then, but as governor, he was expected to keep the peace and administer affairs. He had to hear court cases. He was the only person in the area allowed to impose the death penalty. And his main job was tax revenue, raising revenue for the Romans from the local state. So he had a variety of duties, some of them administrative, some of them judicial.
Okay. So in reading about Pontius Pilate and kind of the way that the Roman governance of the area worked, one of the things that I think I was able to infer, and maybe you can back me up on this, Jimmy, is that he was not of a senatorial class. He was not somebody of a prominent family. He would have been typically, because this was a non-senatorial area, Judea, would have been an equestrian class, which basically means a Roman knight, which means you weren't really a upper echelon Roman, but you probably served with some military distinction. And then that made you like, here's your reward. You can go govern this kind of backwater. Would that be the case, Jimmy?
Yeah, that's basically accurate. We don't know for a fact that he had a military career before he became governor, but it's likely that he did. Roman society was basically society in the city of Rome. This is not true across the Roman Empire, but in the city of Rome, there were basically 4 strata. The lowest was the slaves. Then you had the plebeians or plebs. Then you had the equestrians, and then you had the senatorial class. And so he was, if you don't count the slaves, he's basically middle class. He's a knight. He's an equestrian. And we know his family, though, had been plebeian at one point, because his family name, so the way their names worked, Pontius is actually his family name. We don't know what his personal birth name was. It's not recorded. There were only like 18 male names that were in use at the time, and only 12 of them were common. So that's just way too much replication. The personal name you were given at birth was starting to fade in prominence. And what was becoming more widely used, in addition to the family name, was what was called your cognomen, or cognomen, if you want to pronounce it fancy, which was basically a kind of nickname. And so Pontius Pilate, Pontius is his family name. He's from the Pontii family, and then Pilate, Pilatos in Greek, is his cognomen. It's his nickname. And we know about the Pontii family that they were Samites, which means they were from southern Italy, and they had been plebeian at one time because we know of a figure of a generation or two earlier named Pontius Aquila, who was tribune of the plebs, and that was a position that a plebeian would occupy. So apparently his family had been plebeian, but by Pontius's time, he had achieved equestrian status.
So is there any sense of what Pilatus would mean? Any kind of etymology that kind of lends us to any idea of where that might come from?
There are two proposals. One of them is it may come from the Latin word pilum, and in that case, it would mean something like armed or skilled with a javelin. Pilum is a javelin. The other is that's been proposed is it could mean wearing a pileus. A pileus was a kind of a cap or badge that a manumitted slave would wear. And so it could be derived from that. If I had to guess, I would guess, skilled with a javelin is what it means. And he may have achieved, some martial prowess with a javelin. And it is likely he had a military career, because one of the things that Romans would do, they had it was called the cursus honorum, the course of honors. It was a series of different things you were supposed to achieve on your way to greater and greater honor. And in order to be appointed as a governor of a territory, if you were equestrian, you tended to have a military career first. So I think he probably did have a military career, and he may have been notable for using a javelin during that career.
Okay, that makes sense. So, as governor of Judea, so he would have been, then it sounds like, appointed during the reign of Tiberius.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. It typically reckoned as AD 26.
Okay, which means Tiberius was on Capri, so that was probably Sejanus who gave him the title, and Sejanus was the head of the guard, right? The Praetorian.
Yes, although, so we should mention there's a lot of speculation about Pontius Pilate being appointed by Sejanus. Sejanus, for people who may not be aware, was another equestrian who was the head of the Praetorian Guard, which was sort of the emperor's bodyguard. But Tiberius went through this weird phase as an emperor where he didn't really want to actively govern, and he went off to an island called Capri and stayed there for most of the rest of his reign. He was kind of reclusive. He was into some sexual perversion, and he left the government of Rome basically in the hands of this guy, Sejanus. Sejanus then is widely thought to have plotted against Tiberius, and eventually Tiberius gets word of that, and he engineers Sejanus's downfall in AD 31. So between 26 and 31, Sejanus was effectively in charge of the city of Rome. If you ever want to see a really interesting adaptation of all of this, watch the BBC series from the 1970s, I, Claudius. It has Patrick Stewart as Sejanus, Captain Picard himself.
That's cool.
Only he's got hair. And so if you ever want to see...
that's unsettling.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and Sejanus is kind of an unsettling guy.
Oh, sure.
But anyway, there's a lot of speculation that Pilate may have been appointed by Sejanus, but we don't really know that for a fact. So we kind of want to keep an asterisk around. It's interesting to think about some of the things that Pilate did in relation to if he had, been appointed by Sejanus, but we don't know for a fact that he was.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a lot of conclusions, just like the one you did on the nativity with us previously. There's a lot of conclusions you can draw that just illuminates, in this particular case, the character, where he came from, and again, it's not perfect, but you can draw some conclusions based on various things that, kind of give you a better idea, which is great.
That's how most history is done. Most of the thing has to come from inference, because you just don't have documentation or proof, but you can make these inferences. So Pontius Pilate, where would he have lived? So it's my understanding he would not have lived in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, he would have been, you go there, that's the inner city. You go there when there's trouble or during the festival. But where would he have lived as governor of Judea?
His headquarters was in a town called Caesarea Maritima. There are a variety of different towns called Caesarea after Caesar, and one of them is on the seacoast. So it's a maritime city, and so it's called Caesarea Maritima. It's farther north than Jerusalem is. And that was where the Roman governors were based, not just Pontius Pilate, but others like Felix and Festus, who we read about in the book of Acts. In fact, there's one point in the book of Acts where Paul has just been arrested, and there's a conspiracy to kill Paul, to assassinate him. And all these guys take an oath that they're not going to eat until they've killed Paul. But Paul's nephew learns about this and reports it to the Romans who have Paul in custody, and they whisk him out of Jerusalem by night and ride all night and overnight get him up to Caesarea Maritima so he can be protected by the governor. And those guys presumably are still hungry who were going to kill him.
They never got that meal. So as governor of Judea, first of all, what would some of his responsibilities have been? But then also, he would have kind of been more of a suffragan governor to the governor of Syria. Is that correct?
We're not entirely sure about the relationship between Judea and Syria at this point. It certainly, what we can say with confidence is if there was a problem with the Judean governor, then the next step of recourse would be talk to the Syrian governor. So it looks like the Syrian governor, he at least had more prominence than the governor of Judea. He may have had or may not have had legal authority over the Judean governor. Now, I mentioned, Pilate's duties included collecting taxes, and he also minted coins. So he played a role in keeping the economy going. And actually, Pontius Pilate minted coins in 3 different years in Jerusalem.
Do any of those coins still exist?
We still got them. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
That's how we know about him, is because we got him. And he had to hear court cases. That's why when the Sanhedrin wants to have Jesus put to death, they can't do that themselves because the Romans reserved that right to their own administrators, and so they've got to go to Pilate and have him try Jesus, and those were sort of his basic functions, keeping law and order, stuff like that.
So in reading this, you mentioned Josephus and Philo, that there was some extra biblical record of him, and from what I have read is that some of those record some of the kind of maybe deficiencies or some of the problems that he had as governors, particularly around an aqueduct and using temple funds. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I think that tells us kind of, here's the stuff that Pilate got into and did and struggled with besides the whole crucifixion. Yeah.
So we have one incident that's recorded about Pontius Pilate by Philo, who, for people who may not be aware, Philo was an Alexandrian Jew. He was down in Egypt, but he kept up on affairs in Judea, and he was actively involved. He was a public intellectual. His brother was like a Jewish leader in Alexandria, and so Philo was very heavily involved in Jewish affairs more broadly outside of Alexandria. And he has an incident that he records, which is the incident of the golden shields. And he says that at a certain point in Pilate's reign, he wanted to honor Tiberius. And so what he did was he took a bunch of golden shields that didn't have any imagery on them, because imagery was forbidden for Jews, but it did have some kind of praise of Tiberius written on them. And he put those on the palace of Herod in Jerusalem. And this led to a big hullabaloo. Now, we're not exactly sure what the inscription said because Philo doesn't tell us, but there was such a thing as emperor worship, and Tiberius's adopted dad and mom, his mom and his adopted dad, Augustus and Livia, they were both worshipped as deities. And so there could have been something in that inscription that alluded to this and got the Jews really in a snit about it. And so the Jewish leaders then came to Pilate and said, please take the shields down. He didn't want to do that. They said, well, clearly you're the one who decided to do this unless you can show us a letter from Tiberius telling you to do it. And if you can, let us know, and we'll just write Tiberius about this. And that's what they ended up doing. They wrote Tiberius. It had been
They asked to talk to the manager?
Yeah, it had been Pilate's decision to put up these shields, but they wrote to Tiberius. They said, these are offensive to our sensibilities. Will you please take them down? Philo says they wrote a really flattering letter to Tiberius. Well, he then says that Tiberius immediately got angry at Pilate and wrote a letter back telling him to take down those shields and ship them up to the temple of Augustus in Caesarea Maritima, rather than having them down here in Jerusalem. So this is one of those points where if Pilate had been appointed by Sejanus, that would provide some interest in context for this, because it could be that, he was appointed by Sejanus, and then after Sejanus falls, he's concerned, what's going to happen to me now that my patron has fallen. And so maybe he put up the shields to kind of get in good with Tiberius, and then it backfired on him. It blew up in his face. So that's one possibility. And that's what Philo says. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian that was actually from a priestly family in Jerusalem, he records 4 incidents regarding Pilate. One of them apparently happened really early on in Pilate's tenure, and it's the first one Josephus mentions. He says that he had the Romans bring their standards, which were kind of banners that their military forces would carry with them and use in battle, so you could tell where's it's like carrying a flag today in battle. And he attached images of the emperor to the banners and brought them into Jerusalem. And this was different than what other governors had done. Previous governors had brought in the banners, but without images attached to them, because they knew images were forbidden to the Jewish people. So Tiberius brings them in, and he does it at night. So he knows he's being provocative. That's why he brings the banners with the images in at night. And so this is horribly offensive to the Jewish people. They send an embassy to him up in Caesarea Maritima. They try appealing to him for 5 days about this, and he's just not budging. On the 6th day, he's tired of it. And so he says to his guards, get your swords, keep them kind of hidden, and when I give you the signal, get ready to kill all these Jews who were appealing to me about these banners. And so he has the guards surround the Jewish embassy, and when the Jews realize that their lives are being threatened if they don't knock this off, they all lay down on the ground and bare their necks and say, "Go ahead, cut our heads off. We'd rather die than disobey our religion." So they all stretched out their necks and were ready to die. And at that point, Pilate said, "Oh, these guys are super serious. I guess I'll take those images out of Jerusalem." So he backed down. And that's an important thing to know about him. He is trying to keep the peace. He doesn't want to start rebellions and create martyrs and things like that. So Jewish people did have the ability, if their resolve was firm enough, to get him to back down on decisions or do something he didn't otherwise want to do. So that's Josephus's first incident. The second is the one that you mentioned, which was about the temple funds. So what he wanted to do was build an aqueduct to bring some more water into Jerusalem, and to pay for it, he used money that had been donated to the Jewish temple. So this was sacred money. And this caused mass protests. And he had his guards, in this case, scattered among the people, but dressed in Jewish clothing. So it wasn't obvious they were Romans. And then when he gave the signal, they whipped out clubs and started beating on the civilians. And a bunch of them ran away and trampled each other to death. And so a whole bunch of people died in this case. So that's the second incident that Joseph mentions. The third is the execution of Jesus. This is the famous Testimonium Flavianum, as it's called by fancy people, where he talks about how Pilate crucified Jesus. Unfortunately, this text has been edited by a Christian editor to include more Christian ideas. So scholars have tried to reconstruct exactly what Josephus originally said, but there's some debate about that. And
when
then
you say a Christian scholar, do you mean like in
a scribe?
In recent?
No,
so not recent history.
In the ancient world, this happened.
Okay.
If it was recent, we'd have previous copies we could just look at.
Right.
So like 2nd, 3rd century, 4th century, they go back and add in some Christianization to this.
At some point, we don't know exactly when it happened. And then the fourth incident is the one that actually led to Sejanus to Pilate's downfall. So this is in AD 36. He had a 10-year period from AD 26 to 36 as governor. And there was a false prophet in Samaria, which is between Judea and Galilee. And the Samaritans would worship, they were Israelites, but they wouldn't worship in Jerusalem typically. Instead, they had a temple that had recently been destroyed, actually, but they had a temple on a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And they believed that Mount Gerizim, rather than Mount Zion, was God's chosen place for worship. We read about that in John 4, where Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, and she says, well, we say you should worship here on this mountain, but you Jews say you should worship in Jerusalem. So that's what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. Well, so there's this false prophet, and he tells a whole bunch of Samaritans that Moses hid some sacred vessels on Mount Gerizim. And so what he'll do is take this whole bunch of people to Mount Gerizim, and we'll uncover Moses's sacred vessels. And then, we can celebrate them and worship using them and stuff like that because they're so
Sounds
holy.
like Joseph Smith.
Up to a point. Well, anyway, so the false prophet has this whole rabble of Samaritans who are anxious to go find Moses' sacred vessels, and they're starting to head to Mount Gerizim, and Pilate blocks the road with a military force. And this leads to a confrontation where a bunch of the Samaritans get killed. Others get imprisoned, and then after they're imprisoned, Pilate executes the leaders of the Samaritan community that he had arrested. And so, well, of course, the Samaritans were not happy about this, and they had not been. Now, presumably, Pilate did this because he thought it could lead to some kind of uprising, but they could point out that, we weren't doing an uprising. We just wanted to find sacred vessels. And he attacked us and killed a bunch of us and imprisoned a bunch of us and executed a bunch of us. So what they did was they went to the legate of Syria, the next most major guy, and his name was Vitellius, and they appealed to Vitellius, and because Sejanus was a Roman citizen, he had the right, just like St. Paul did, to appeal his case to Caesar. So Vitellius can't really administer justice here on a fellow citizen. So what he does is he orders he orders Pilate to go to Jerusalem to have his case heard by Tiberius. And he sends a temporary administrator named Marcellus down to Jerusalem to kind of fill in. And so Pilate goes off to Rome, but Tiberius dies in March of 37 before Pilate gets there. And so we're not really sure what happened at that point. What we know is he didn't come back. But there could be multiple reasons for him not coming back. One reason is that, now he may not have had, so Tiberius, after Tiberius died, the throne was inherited by Caligula. And it apparently was common for incoming emperors to just dismiss legal matters that were holdovers from the previous emperor's tenure. And so Caligula may have said, I don't want to hear this case. Just forget it. And didn't renew his appointment. So he may not have had a hearing. On the other hand, he may have had a hearing, and it may have gone fine for him, but he had been governor for 10 years. That is an extraordinarily long time for someone to be governor. They had 1-year appointments, basically, and those 1-year appointments could be renewed. But if you look at the previous 4 governors of Judea, 3 of them only served for 3 years each. His predecessor, Gratus, had served for 11 years. And at 10 years, it's really time for this guy to retire and move on to something else. So the hearing actually could have gone perfectly fine for him, and he could have just not been reappointed. On the other hand, it could have gone badly for him, and he could have been exiled or something like that. So there are a number of possibilities about what could happen. All we can say with confidence is he didn't go back.
Okay. So the next 2 things I want to get into. One, I want to get into Pilate's involvement in the Passion. And I think that's the most important thing that we're going to get into. But before we do that, since we're still kind of going on the backstory and some of the archaeological evidence, could you tell us about the Pilate stone? Because I think that's one of the more clear evidences that we have of that you could say, look, this is 100% extra biblical proof that Pilate was there and was who the Bible says he was.
Yeah, so the Pilate stone is a stone that has an inscription on it that mentions Pilate. The stone was discovered in 1961. It was discovered in Caesarea Maritima. It apparently had originally been part of a building called the Tiberium. And we're not sure what the Tiberium was. It may have been a temple, but we're not sure. In any event, the Pilate stone mentions the Tiberium, and it mentions that it was, dedicated by Pontius Pilate. And this stone was part of it for a long time, but eventually whatever the Tiberium was, it got torn down. And then, as they do in Egypt and Israel and other places in the Middle East, they reused the stone. At some point in the Middle Ages, they used it to build part of a staircase. And in 1961, an Italian archaeologist discovered it as part of the staircase. And so she published about it. This was definite archaeological confirmation of Pilate's existence, and it made a big splash. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us too much other than that he was dedicating this building that somehow honored Tiberius.
So now let's go from then Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem. So number one, it sounds like being the Roman governor of Judea is not a terribly fun job for a Roman. It sounds like you're getting the problem branch because there's so many religious sensitivities. It's not really a rich area. It's not a glorious job.
No, there were much more prestigious postings. If in the modern world, if let's say getting appointed ambassador to England is a big deal, this is more like being an appointed ambassador to, Zimbabwe or something.
Yeah. So this is just like, hey, here, take this, go. And it sounds like a hard job, but I mean, from having been in the role for 10 years, he was probably pretty good, but also that could be just chalked up to the disinterest of Tiberius, the intrigue around Sejanus, and then Caligula coming in. Like, it could have just been like, yeah, just leave that guy there. We got bigger stuff to deal with. But
yeah, actually, that's something I wanted to point out because Pilate has a really bad reputation. And when you read Philo and Josephus, all they do about him is complain. And so if you take that and don't set it in a broader context, it can make it sound like he was a really bad governor. But if he was a really bad governor, he wouldn't have lasted 10 years. Because they could and did complain about governors and got them yanked. Sure. And so, I mean, the fact he had this extraordinarily long reign as a governor actually testifies to his competence in the role. And when you set, like around 4 notably bad incidents that historians mention in a 10-year reign, that's an occasional bump. That's not chronic mismanagement or chronic hostility.
Yeah, it's like Yelp reviews. People only go on to leave bad reviews of restaurants. They never go on and say, hey, this was great.
Yeah.
In Josephus' body of work, because he was Jewish, do you think in some cases he would be sensationalizing some of the pressure that the Jews put on him as kind of a precipice for future Jews to take particular action, or do you think it was pretty accurate?
Not for that reason. Josephus and Philo both are partisans, and so they have a desire to make certain Romans look bad. In the case of Philo, where he talks about Pilate, it's in a document called "On the Embassy to Gaius," and this was during Caligula's reign. Gaius Caligula wanted to have a statue of himself put in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple.
Dang.
Yeah. Well,
that's a big deal.
That caused a huge crisis. And the governor of Syria at that point knew what a huge crisis. I mean, this would lead to war. And the Jews were like just all protesting. They were not planting their crops. They were not raising their food. It was a really bad scene. And he's writing Caligula trying to get him to back off. And Caligula's not having it. Well, the good news is before he actually sent the governor of Syria a letter saying, I don't care, go in, put that statue in. And before the letter arrived, now the governor had been doing delaying tactics, but before the letter insisting, it didn't end up having to be enforced because Caligula was such a horrible emperor, his own Praetorian Guard killed him. And so that made this a dead letter, literally. And so that's why that didn't end up happening. But one of the efforts there were, of course, other efforts by the Jews themselves to try to get Caligula to change his mind. And so one of them was led by Philo of Alexandria. This was one of the ways he was involved in broader Judaism. He led an embassy to go talk to Caligula and try to convince him, and they weren't successful, but he wrote an account of what they did when talking to Caligula. And one of the things he mentions, he talks about Tiberius, Caligula's predecessor, and how he was always so respectful of our sensibilities and let us keep our own laws, and, we'll be loyal, subjects of the Roman Empire if you just leave us alone and let us have our own religion. And Tiberius, he was the guy you want to emulate, not that Pontius Pilate guy who Tiberius got so mad at over the incident with the golden shields. You want to be like Tiberius. And so it's in Philo's interest to paint Pontius Pilate in the worst possible light, to provide a contrast for Tiberius as the good guy that Caligula should emulate. So that's how Philo's agenda works. Josephus's agenda is a little bit different. Josephus cares about two things. One is himself, and another is how his Jewish people are regarded by the Romans. So he's writing this 20-volume set. It took 20 scrolls to contain the whole thing after the Jewish War, which they totally lost. By the way, pro tip, if you're leading a rebellion, do not burn your own food supply when you're under siege. that's a bad idea. It will not work out well for you if you burn your own food supply. That's
what was that for? Well, why would they do that? It's just
in Jerusalem, there were like 3 different factions of zealots who were all struggling for control, and
Gotcha.
and to make people fight harder and hang together better, they thought, oh, if we don't have this food supply we can fall back on, that'll motivate everyone because it'll be really serious then.
It's like Stalin's not one step back.
Something like that.
Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, so they totally got stomped in the Jewish war, which they didn't have to. For a while, it was looking really good, but then it went really bad. And so after the war, Josephus, who had been a general on the Jewish side in the Jewish war, but he flipped sides. He got caught, and he then prophesied to the Roman general Vespasian that, oh, God has revealed to me you're going to be made emperor. And it's like, okay, we'll see. And they kept him under close arrest for a couple of years. And then he gets promoted to emperor. And suddenly, oh, Josephus is a true prophet of God. And then after the war, Josephus writes a history of the war. And then he writes his 20-scroll or 20-volume set called Antiquities of the Jews, which is a history of the Jewish people. It includes all the stuff in the Old Testament and more down to his day, which is about AD 100. And so he's writing Antiquities of the Jews, and he wants Romans to understand his is an ancient and respectable people. He wants his own people to understand, do not try to overthrow Roman rule. They are too strong. It will not work. And so he tries to balance his presentation of the Romans as not being purely evil, because they're he has a pension from Vespasian, they're his benefactors. And so he doesn't want to portray the Romans as super bad, not all of them, but he does want to portray the Roman governors of Judea as broadly bad to make it understandable to Romans why Jews would want to rebel and what led to the Jewish war. So there's some desire on his part to paint at least the Roman governors in the pre-war period in a somewhat negative light.
And that would have included Pilate.
Yes.
There you go. So let's now move to the Passion. Mm-hmm. So Pilate would have typically resided in Caesarea, mm-hmm. but he would come down to Jerusalem for the Passover.
Passover. Yep.
Because you got to be where the action's at.
Right? Yeah. So apparently there were like 1 million pilgrims in Jerusalem for Passover. It was massive. And also, if you have this concentration of the nation and international travelers as well. But if you have this concentration of the Jewish people, that's going to let all of the malcontents get together. And this is a holy time, and they might try to do something, or your Romans might try to do something. There's a famous incident where basically a bunch of Romans at the temple started mooning the Jewish pilgrims, which then led to violence, when they're showing their butts and at your sacred temple. Yeah.
I think that's the intent.
Yeah. So anyway, he needed to be in Jerusalem to keep the peace, basically, and show them that we're still here, we're in charge, all that kind of stuff. So that's why he was there.
Where would he have resided in Jerusalem? And is that the same place where the trial of Jesus would have happened? Well,
we're told in the Gospels that the trial of Jesus occurred at a place called the Praetorium. And John 18:28 says that, for example. The term Praetorium originally referred to a tent where in a military camp where the praetor had his headquarters. here it's not referring to a tent, but a building. And we're not entirely sure which building it is. There's two candidates. One of them is a place called the Antonia Fortress, which is a castle of the former Hasmonean Jewish dynasty that had kind of been refurbished and stuff like that. And this is the one, if you go to Jerusalem today as a Christian pilgrim, they'll show you where the Antonia Fortress was and say, this is where the trial happened. It's part of the Via Dolorosa. It's not entirely certain, though, that it was the Antonia Fortress. Some sources point towards the Antonia Fortress, but others point to instead the Herodian Palace near the West Gate of the old city of Jerusalem. So so some sources favor Antonia Fortress, some favor the Herodian Palace. We're not sure which it is, but basically it's a Jewish building that had been prominent in local Jewish government that Pilate had, co-opted for his own residence in Jerusalem.
Yeah, he's taking quarters there. So for Pilate, he's there. You got 1 million people. This is the kind of thing that makes your job look bad. Get someone to write a letter to your boss. This is the kind of thing that led to this massacre or this trouble. So he just doesn't want any trouble.
Right.
And like you said, there's a lot of people trying to cause problem with religious sensibilities. And
there had been recently a riot, which is why Barabbas and the two bandits that Jesus is crucified between are imprisoned at this point. Yeah.
So that imprisonment was something that was relatively recent in time for his trial.
Yeah, so probably within the week or two or something of that nature. So what would Pilate have thought? I mean, how would Pilate have even had this case brought to him? Would this have just been a mundane another trial, probably doing 10 of these a day? Or, from Pilate's point of view, he's looking out from the Antonium or whatever, and he's just like, all right, next case. Like how does Pilate experience this? Because Pilate has no idea what he's getting himself into.
Yeah, so it's interesting when you read the Gospels. Now, before he's brought to Pilate, Jesus is put on trial by the Sanhedrin. And this is discussed in all 4 of the Gospels. And they provide different information about what went on in that initial trial. But one of the things that is pretty consistent is they say they brought a lot of witnesses against him, and the witnesses didn't agree with each other. So they got conflicting testimony. And at some point, and Jesus is not saying anything. And so at some point, they, urge him to speak, and he refuses because Jesus doesn't want to be let off. That's why he's not talking, is because he's going to the cross. He's not trying to get out of this. He's going to bear the sins of mankind and go to the cross. So he's not defending himself at all. Well, at one point, the high priest, Joseph Caiaphas, turns to Jesus and says, because they're looking for what can we convict this guy on. Some people said, he said, I'll tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But, who knows what that means from their point of view. And so finally, the high priest goes to the center of the matter and he says, tell us plainly, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Now, that is not a crime under Jewish law.
Right.
Because the Jewish law says there's going to be a coming Messiah, and the Davidic kings are regarded as sons of God. Solomon was adopted as God's son when he became king and so forth. So being the Christ, the Son of God, that is not a crime, but under Jewish law, but it can be under Roman law because you haven't been appointed by the Roman Senate as king. And so he's laying the pretext for something we can go to Pilate with, something Pilate's going to care about, because he's not going to care that this is just some Jewish leader we don't like. We need a charge that'll stick under Roman law.
So like the Sanhedrin's like a grand jury. They're just trying to find anything they could bring as a case. I got it.
Their function is one. They are themselves. They do have judicial power, but what they don't have is the power of capital punishment. And they want to kill Jesus. They don't want to just imprison him or exile him or something like that. So they need to find something that they can use as a capital charge with the Roman governor. And being a political revolutionary who rebels against Roman authority is one such thing. So what Jesus says in response, though, blows Caiaphas's mind. He says, I am, and from now on, you shall see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, that is a reference to the book of Daniel, where in Daniel has a vision of the Ancient of Days, meaning God, being enthroned in heaven with his heavenly court, and then riding on a cloud comes one like a son of man. And this Son of Man does not come from the earth. He's a cloud rider, and being a cloud rider is an attribute of divinity. You know, the Psalms talk about God rides the clouds. And so in Second Temple Judaism, which is when this has taken place, there was an idea. This is called the two powers in heaven doctrine by modern scholars. There was this idea that there's a second divine figure in heaven. He's sometimes called the lesser Yahweh. And so you've got Yahweh and then the lesser Yahweh. And by identifying himself as the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, Jesus is saying, I'm him. I'm the lesser Yahweh. And it's at that point that the high priest tears his robes and says, you've all heard the blasphemy. We don't need any more witnesses.
But it's vacillating between the conviction in the under Roman law and then Jewish law. So it's kind of being placed there and then being brought back.
Right. So Jesus has now, in Caiaphas's view, committed blasphemy, so he can be convicted under Jewish law, but they still need something to stick him with under Roman law. So they take him to Pilate, and Pilate's initial reaction is like, none of this has anything to do with me. Why are you here? And they say, well, he claims to be a king. And okay, well, that gets Pilate's attention. But then, like in John's gospel, Jesus explains, my kingship is not of this world. If it was, my followers would fight, and they didn't. And so my kingship is heavenly, not earthly. And so Pilate backs off, and so that's why Pilate vacillates. It's because they're trying to get this political revolutionary charge to stick, and now Jesus is undermining it. He's saying, no, that's not what I'm interested in. I don't want worldly power. And so that's why Pilate is vacillating on this question. Eventually, though, the Jews say, well, if you don't execute him, you are no friend of Caesar. Okay.
Threatened to go to his boss, yeah.
Yeah, well, and especially because friend of Caesar was a title in the Roman Empire. Only certain people got to be called friend of Caesar. And he may have been one of those. Now, it's not 100% certain he was, but because they raised his charge, it's quite possible that he had the title friend of Caesar, and they're saying, oh, no, you're not if you don't execute this guy and look after Caesar's business by putting down potential revolutionaries before the revolution starts. Because what that is that's an implicit threat of, we're going to go to Caesar and report this to him. And he's already on shaky ground with Tiberius. He got slapped down over the
shields.
Well, the shield, over the shields in particular. And so, like with the images on the standards, he backs down and he gives them what they want. And he agrees to let Jesus be executed, but he washes his hands as a sign of, I disown this act. I don't take, even though I am responsible for it, I'm not taking responsibility for it. It's like the buck stops with me, but that doesn't mean I pay any price. We've heard that recently from a few government officials.
Is that why he put King of the Jews on his cross too?
That's the next thing I was going to mention. Yeah. So he puts in Greek and Latin and Hebrew, which probably means Aramaic in this case. He writes Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, on a placard and has it put on the cross. Why does he do that? Well, one reason may be because he wants to humiliate the Jewish leaders who have pushed him into this. Yeah. But I think the more probable reason or the more certain reason is that if you're going to execute someone on the charge of being a Jewish revolutionary, even if you don't really believe he is one, why let that go to waste? Show all the other potential Jewish revolutionaries. This is what happens to would-be King of the Jews. So this is you, Mr. Jewish revolutionary. If you start getting uppity, you're going to end up on a cross just like this King of the Jews.
Which is probably a good point, because, the one big thing that goes on in the area that he's governing, for something to go wrong, that would be the time that you would probably most look after it, during the Passover.
Would Pilate have, so I suppose the formal charge from a Roman legal standpoint against Jesus would have been sedition?
Depending on how it be phrased, but basically, yeah. Or treason, or however you want to put it.
Would the cleansing of the temple, would that have gotten to the Roman standard? I mean, because like you said,
that's a matter of Jewish law. Who would care about that is the Jewish authorities. And I think Jesus did that in order to put the Jewish authorities on notice and in part to provoke them. So that minor temple uprising thing was aimed at the Jewish authorities rather than the Romans.
So two more things then about the trial that I want to go to.
From the Roman point of view, this would just be a minor scuffle in the temple.
Just like whatever. Yeah. Pilate's wife, she's mentioned in the Gospels.
Yep.
She's a saint in the Byzantine and the Orthodox churches. I don't know about in the West. But she has this dream.
Pilate himself is a saint in the Coptic church and the Ethiopian Tewahedo church. Tewahedo church, yeah.
So I want to get into that, because then I want to talk about Pilate's life after this, the conjecture there. But tell us a little bit about Pilate's wife and the dream she had and how she might have tried to influence Pilate.
Well, we don't really know a whole lot. Just basically what's in Matthew's gospel. She sent Pilate a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, because I suffered much on his account in a dream." So apparently she had a dream about Jesus, and it was an unpleasant dream, and it made it clear to her that Jesus is innocent and he should not be messed with. So she wanted to communicate that to her husband. As far as what the content of the dream was, we can infer some of those basic themes that must have been part of it, but we don't know its exact content. I find it very intriguing, this is almost certainly not what the dream was, but an artistic representation of it is found in Dorothy Sayers' radio play, The Man Who Would Be King, where she has a dream, and in the dream she hears millions and millions and millions of voices saying, "Crucified under Pontius Pilate." Crucified under Pontius Pilate, over, and it's like, okay, I don't know what the dream was, but that's a cool representation of it.
But he washed his hands.
Yeah. So Pontius Pilate's wife's name, what I've got is Claudia Procula. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's an interesting side note that you have this his wife saying, "Hey, honey, probably going to be a rough day at the office today. Stay away from this case." The one other thing I want to talk about then in the trial itself is, well, actually, there's kind of one and a half things. First is the whole presentation of Barabbas and giving the crowd the option between Jesus Barabbas and Jesus of Nazareth, which is a really interesting concept. What was that all about? Was that him trying to keep the peace?
Yeah, and according to the Gospels, this was a regular custom. He'd do this every Passover, and it is not unknown in history for authorities to release prisoners to please the populace and keep the local temperature low. That happens in other situations too. If you have political prisoners who have been locked up, but they're popular on the outside, you may decide, keeping them in jail is something that could lead to a bigger uprising than if I just let them go, and especially if I make them promise not to lead any uprisings. Just go home and you're okay. You're not going to have to die right now. Just go home and behave yourself. And so there are situations where political prisoners get released. Also, it can become regularized because once you've done it once, then they may expect you to do it again. And so as long as the system's working for you, as they say, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. So if you've got a system where, okay, every Passover, I know this is a special holiday to you Jews, I'm going to show you, I know most of the year I have to show you Roman strictness, because we all got to get along and make this work. But now I'm going to show you Roman mercy, and it's good for PR.
Yeah.
And so who would you like me to release? And he's kind of stumping for release Jesus, who he believes is not a revolutionary, as opposed to Barabbas. Now, it's interesting, the name Barabbas means in Aramaic, son of the father. And so it's interesting, you've got the divine son of the father and this criminal son of the father, and the criminal one gets let go because of the divine mission for the divine son of the father. It's very likely that Barabbas was the leader of the uprising that had recently taken place, that the other two criminals Jesus gets crucified between were part of.
Was this the mooning episode? And the riot from that?
That was a different episode.
Okay.
Yeah. We don't know exactly what the cause of this uprising was.
So, to me, one of the most interesting questions ever asked by any human was from Pilate to Jesus during his examination of him, where he says, "Quid est veritas?" It's such a, I don't know. I mean,
it sounds awful cynical,
right?
Yeah. What is truth?
Yeah. But is there any conjecture of what Pilate's demeanor would have been like? Would he have been kind of, what's going on here? Would he have had a glimpse, or was he just kind of, hey, I got 10 cases on the docket today, whatever. What is truth? Take them, what would or does the gospel infer kind of his inner emotion, or even just his experience in this conversation with Jesus at the trial?
Well, we don't know how many other cases he had that day, if any. So that's a matter of conjecture. And all the data we really have here is what's in the Gospels themselves. And so I would say it's open to interpretation. And, if you were putting this on in a stage play or a movie, there's considerable room for how to interpret the character of Pilate differently. And he's been interpreted differently down through history. Some have very positive, some Christians have had very positive appraisals of Pilate. Others have had very negative appraisals of Pilate. I tend to think he's kind of in the middle. He's not super bad, but he's not super good either.
I guess the Ethiopian Coptics can't really.
Ethiopians and Coptics are two different groups. They're both Oriental Orthodox, though.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess from their declaration of sainthood, they don't go through the process that we do, and something like that. It's just kind of a traditional approach to that.
Well, I would assume now these days, I would suspect that like the Coptic Pope would probably have a role in canonizations today, but this is an old canonization, so he may well not have, just like we didn't used to have the Pope involved in canonizations.
So, I mean, then that's the presumption then that after the crucifixion and probably after being recalled to Rome that he converted. I mean, if his wife is a saint, Maybe she converted him. I mean,
maybe. So this is where we really don't know. And there's this massive literature that was written in later centuries, particularly in the Middle Ages, about Pilate. It's called the Pilate cycle, and which sounds like something you'd ride, the Pilate cycle.
It's great exercise.
Yeah, but it wildly disagrees with itself. In some versions of it, Pilate is a villain who goes off and gets exiled and kills himself. In other versions, he becomes a Christian and is martyred for his faith. And so we really don't have any reliable traditions. The most reliable that we have are fairly early things, and they don't point now. So, okay, Tertullian, and he's writing about the year 200. Tertullian, the North African author, says Pilate was a Christian in conscience. That could mean he's fully Christian, or it could mean he just didn't want to kill Jesus. So it's ambiguous to me. I'd have to do more research in Tertullian and see, does he clarify that? But just from the statement that he was a Christian in conscience doesn't mean to me that he was a full Christian. I can see other interpretations for what that could mean. It's just he had a Christian sensibility about don't kill this guy. Earlier, now Eusebius, writing around 325 or so, around 320, he's the father of church history, and he says that tradition says that Pilate killed himself shortly after his hearing in Rome. And that could easily be people did kill themselves, as opposed to if they saw things are going badly for them with their hearing with the emperor, they might kill themselves. They might even be ordered to kill themselves, or like all their property is going to get confiscated.
Yep.
So that's believable, but you'll notice he says tradition says this. He doesn't say this historical document says it. So this could be a word-of-mouth tradition. It may not be reliable. And when you go earlier and look at earlier figures like Celsus, who was a pagan, and Origen, they're talking about Pilate, and Celsus says, well, if your Jesus was really the Son of God and Pilate put him to death, why didn't Pilate get punished? And Origen says, because he didn't really want to do it. But you'll notice what they're both agreeing on is Pilate didn't get punished. Mm-hmm. And if he had committed suicide, rather than face some Roman justice or something, then they would have mentioned that. So it sounds like they think he lived a natural life. He didn't die in some horrible way, like suicide or an unexpected illness or something like that. And Philo appears, at least I've seen this argued, appears to refer to Pilate in a way that suggests he's no longer living, and he also doesn't mention any negative fate in connection with Pilate's death. Now, he is writing only shortly after Pilate was recalled, so I think that if it's right that Philo is writing about Pilate as no longer alive, he probably didn't live that much longer. But he doesn't suggest anything bad happened to him, which would make sense given Philo's rhetorical strategy, because he would want to say to Caligula, you don't want to be like that, disrespectful Pilate guy who disrespected the religion that the God of heaven has given us, and then look at what happened to him. Mm-hmm. So
if he had something to hang on Pilate, he would have said, look, Pilate did this, so Pilate definitely got punished. You want to avoid that. So
yeah. So I think that, of course, Caligula thinks he's, a greater god than Zeus, but, that's Caligula.
And Caligula didn't have any love for Tiberius either, so.
Not too much.
He killed his mom and his brothers and kept them prisoner, and yeah.
Yeah. But in any event, given Philo's rhetorical strategy and given the way Celsus and Origen talk about Pilate, it seems to me that he probably did not kill himself or suffer any other kind of horrible death from what we can tell.
So one last thing. There's one last thing I want to get into, and this is something that I had been thinking about. But real quick, I just want to mention a couple things. So if you're watching this and you like this kind of content, make sure you're clicking like and subscribe. It really helps us. Helps this video to get to more people, helps Jimmy Akin be able to reach people with this amazing information that we've heard today, and we really appreciate it. Also, make sure and go and follow Jimmy, number one on Catholic Answers. He's got a lot of great books. We're going to put together a special page on one of our websites, Everything Catholic, with some of Jimmy's books, so you can go and see some of the things that he's written, which I 100% wholeheartedly recommend, like Fathers Know Best, stuff like that, right? And then also Mysterious World with Jimmy Akin that Ryan mentioned earlier is such a great podcast. If you're into this kind of this detail and this exploration of interesting and fascinating topics, I cannot recommend it enough. I also want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Hallow. Hallow is the #1 Catholic prayer app, and it's a marvelous app to explore your prayer life. So you can get into things like daily examines and daily rosary, reflections on the gospel with people like Father Mike Schmidch or Bishop Barron or Jonathan Rumi. There's all sorts of different prayer activities and so many different things like sacred music. There's a reason that over 1 billion prayers have been said to this app, and, it was the #1 app in the App Store. I mean, when you can have technology and the tradition of church come together and make such a cultural impact, I think they're doing a great job. So if you go to CatholicTalkShow.com/Hallow, you could try this app out 100% free and see how it can help really grow your prayer life. The second thing I want to talk about is that we're going to be going on a pilgrimage to Italy for the Jubilee year in 2025. So we're going to be going to a lot of great places. We're going to be going to Rome, and we'll see the 4 major basilicas. We'll see relics of Peter and Paul. We'll go to Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome and see relics of the Crucifixion. We'll even see the stairs that might have come from the Antonio, the 33 stairs that Jesus climbed up. We'll have an audience with the Pope. We're going to also be in Milan. We'll be in Turin, where we'll get to see Da Vinci's Last Supper, the Shroud of Turin. We're going to get to see the relics of St. Francis of Assisi and Carlos Acutis and St. John Bosco. This is going to be a trip of a lifetime. So if you go to CatholicTalkShow.com/Rome, you could register. There's very few seats left. Everyone's trying to get to Rome for the Jubilee year. So make sure that you go and check that out if you're interested. So Jimmy, the last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is one of the things that kind of inspired in my head why I wanted to talk about Pontius Pilate on the show here. So I was praying the Sorrowful Mysteries, and I was thinking about the crowning. Mm-hmm. And then then afterwards, I'm like, okay, I want a little bit more visualization. So then I went and watched the crucifixion scene from Passion of the Christ. Mm-hmm. And in this, they have all these Roman centurions, and they're dressed to the nines, and they all look like Brian Delacrosse and his brothers, like very Italian, and they're all speaking Latin, right? I mean, just aggressively Italian-looking dudes. Like they probably on the side own like a deli. Yeah, they own a deli in New York, and like, hey, right? So then I was thinking about it. So you got these Romans, these of Italian descent, or from the peninsula. Mm-hmm. So then I'm like, okay, well, what legion would have been there? And what legion was it? Was this the Legio X? Was this the Spanish Legion? Whatever. And the things that I was able to research was that it probably wouldn't have been Latins or Italians. It probably would have been, number one, because Pilate was an equestrian and not senatorial class, he wouldn't have even led a legion. He would have gotten a cohort. Mm-hmm. And a cohort was typically drawn from the local areas instead of being populated by ethnic Italians. And then some of the conjecture that I read that his cohort would have been from Samaritans, and that the Samaritans would have been the legion or the cohort, and that might. So when you picture the crucifixion you picture all these Italian guys, but it could have very well been that the people hammering the nails were Samaritans who were in the Roman army. So what are your thoughts on that, Jim? Because that's something that to me is a really fine nuance, but to think who actually was the one carrying out the order of the execution. You always think Italians, but that might not have been the case.
Well, it's certainly true that Romans had a lot of military forces that were non-Italian. There were various groups within the Roman military apparatus, for example, that were German. And that was even though the Germanic tribes were resistant to Rome and had been fighting battles with the Romans. Like, for example, during the time of Augustus, there was a massive battle in the Teutoburg Forest, which is up in Germany.
Give me back my legions.
Yeah, well, my eagles. I was just going to say, the general in charge of that was Quintilius Varus, and he had Germans on his side who were like going up against their own countrymen, except they betrayed him and they led him into a trap, and the Romans got massacred by the Germans, and they captured 3 of the Roman eagles. Now, the eagles were not literal eagles. They were statues of eagles that the Romans carried around with them as standards. And the Germans captured 3 eagles from 3 Roman legions. And this was a severe humiliation to the Romans. And reportedly Augustus would go around in the imperial household crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my eagles." But they still had a lot of Germans in their military. In fact, the emperors, I know at least by the time of Caligula, and I think by the time of Tiberius, had a German bodyguard in addition to a Roman bodyguard, meaning not just one bodyguard, but groups of bodyguards. Mm-hmm. And so they did draw on locals for the military forces. And it was a way to get a job. It was a way to get good pay. It was a way to, be macho. People all over the world are interested in those things. And so they did have a kind of cosmopolitan military. And given that Pilate was only equestrian, it's quite possible that he may have only had a cohort at his disposal, and that it could have incorporated locals in it. I've read, and I don't know that this is true because I've only seen it from one person who was an amateur researcher rather than a professional historian, that in the time of Pilate, Jerusalem had cohors to Italica. As the cohort that was garrisoned there. And I wonder about that name, cohors 2. So the second Italian cohort is basically what that would mean. And I wonder though, if Italian cohort in this case means it's composed of Italians. I don't know the answer to that, but those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah. Super interesting and fascinating. Just in thinking about Pontius Pilate and the role he played in the crucifixion, and then when we're saying the creed, when we say been crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Right. Yeah, that's in both creeds. That's in both the Nicene and the Apostles.
Why did they include that so specifically?
Because it grounds this event in history. This is not a mythological event. It's not like in other religions where Krishna has a conversation with Arjuna before this big battle or whatever. This really happened, and they're telling you when it happened. Under Pontius Pilate, that is a very specific, that's a decade. That's between AD 26 and AD 36. So they're telling you right when it happened.
Yeah, so it's like, hey, this is not fanciful. This is boom. And I think that's so fascinating that was so intentionally included, that what is essentially, Judas isn't in there. They don't say, Christ betrayed by Judas, crucified under Pontius Pilate. And what is, in some sense, could be the arch villain of Christianity, Pontius Pilate, is in our key creeds. It's a very fascinating thing. And Pontius Pilate, just a very fascinating figure about how somebody more or less just out there doing their job gets caught up in the theodrama, how he gets swept up into this. And it's just such an interesting thing to ponder and to really meditate on.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Thanks for joining us, Jimmy.
No, my pleasure. Anytime.
So, Jimmy, would you tell everyone a little bit more about where they can find more from you?
Yeah. So for my day job, I'm the senior apologist at Catholic Answers. In fact, I'm the senior employee at Catholic Answers. I've been there longer than anyone else.
Congratulations.
More than 30 years now. Thank you. And so you can go to Catholic.com, which is our website, because it was the 90s and we thought ahead. So Catholic.com is a Catholic Answers website. We got lots of great, thousands of online resources for you for free right there. You can also check out my website, jimmyakin.com, which is kind of a hub for what I do on the web. And you can check out my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/jimmyakin. And to get to either my website or my YouTube channel, all you got to do is spell my name. Jimmy is Jimmy. Akin is just like it sounds. AKIN. There are no E's, T's, or S's in Akin. It is just like it sounds, Akin, AKIN. So if you go to jimmyakin.com or youtube.com/jimmyakin, you can access my materials, and I got a lot of great stuff, including Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In fact, after reviewing all the Pilate evidence preparing for this interview, I decided I'm going to do an episode of Mysterious World on Pilate. So
Awesome.
People can look forward to that. You can also find Mysterious World by going to mysterious.fm.
Great.
Awesome. Well, Jimmy, it's always an honor to have you on, and I really just enjoyed listening to you, and to be able to be on a podcast with you and interview instead of just passively listening really is it's a great experience and one of the real perks of doing the Catholic Talk Show.
Well, thank you. The honor is all mine, and always happy to come back.
And then Ryan, we're continuing to pray for Jen, and we encourage all of our audience to continue to do that as well. If you want to support us, you can go to CatholicTalkShow.com/Patreon. You can see all the different ways that you can support us and get really great gifts back from us in our gratitude. Ryan, you want to close us out here?
Yeah. How you want me to close this out? We'll see you
Say
next
goodbye,
week.
Ryan. All right, take care.
We'll see you next week.
And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.